this evening. St Paul has always been something of a Marmite character. Some of us, people like me, I love Paul, always have done. Some of us think that he's a wonderful evangelist, great hero of the church who brought the gospel to the Gentiles, and I love his passion. I like to think of Paul pacing up and down his prison cell, getting terribly excited with St Paul's scribe trying to keep up. So there are those of us who absolutely love St Paul. There are others who think that Paul is some kind of misogynist, homophobic person who distorted the true message of Jesus. But this evening and the next subsequent weeks have the opportunity to make up our own mind. So it's with absolute delight and pleasure, I'm very honoured to welcome Dr. Dave Allen as our speaker. Dave is, can I get this correct, Academic Dean at the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham. He's married to Becky, who is the vicar in Sutton Coldfield. And they've got two boys who are 13 and 11. Is that right?
10, not bad.
13 and 10, I wasn't far off.
Close.
And he's an inspirational speaker, and I did a course with him earlier this year all about St Paul and absolutely loved it. So I'm sure we're in for a wonderful treat. So without further ado, let's just bow our heads and we'll have a prayer, and I'll hand over to Dave. Father God, thank you for this evening. Thank you for the Bible. We ask that you bless us, give us ears to hear what you have to say to us. Guide us by your Spirit. Give us wisdom, give us understanding, give us insight. We ask that you bless Dave as he speaks to us. Give him your words. And may we be really enriched by this evening and draw near to you. In Jesus' name. Amen. Round of applause for our speaker, please.
Well, good evening, everyone. Can I just check that you can hear me? So I kind of talk at that kind of pace. I'm nodding. That's great. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's the first time I've been to Penn. I've been a fairly infrequent visitor to Wolverhampton as well, I'm afraid. Been to the football here. But I think that's probably the only time I've been to Wolverhampton. So it's been a pleasure to be with you over the next few weeks. I live in Sutton Coldfield, where my wife is a vicar. I've been in Queens now for about 10 years. But I'm originally from South London, from a place called Woolwich. And that means I'm an Arsenal fan. Yes! So Arsenal is my true god, and I dabble with us on the sidelines. So thank you for the invitation. It's going to be good to be with you. Over the next, I think we've got 4 sessions together, and I hope there'll be a good opportunity to engage with this Marmite figure of St Paul. We're going to do 4 sessions. Tonight we're going to say something about the Damascus Road, or the Damascus Road experience. It's hard to say what happens on the Damascus Road, and that's really going to be part of our conversation, I hope. Next time, we'll say a little bit about Paul the theologian. How does Paul ask us to do theology? How do we do theology with St Paul? Our third session, we'll say a little bit about Jesus. It's one of the fairly well established notions, I might suggest, within Pauline studies, is that Paul doesn't talk about Jesus very much. He doesn't talk about Jesus. He talks a lot about Christ. He talks a lot about Christ's death and resurrection. But it's often said that Paul doesn't talk a lot about Jesus, about his deeds, about his miracles, about his teaching. So we'll explore that in our third session. And then for our kind of great climax, we'll kind of try and say a little bit about some of the more touchy-feely, difficult issues around Pauline interpretation. So we'll solve the question around Paul in gender, we'll solve the question around Paul and same-sex relationships, we'll solve the questions around Paul and church planting. All of that, all in an hour or so. We'll have those big ones sorted once and for all, I promise you. As we begin, can I invite you just to ponder the picture of Paul on the screen? It's the picture that I've used a number of times when I'm teaching and lecturing on Paul. But for the first time tonight, something that struck me very strange about that. I don't know whether you noticed at all. Is his elbow in a strange position? It feels a bit low now. That's probably all you remember about tonight, that Dave said the elbow's a bit low. But just kind of struck me, that was a bit strange. But, we'll be using these images of Paul. We'll try and have a visual element as we go. I'm hoping that we'll split the next hour or so up into, I can do it into kind of 3 parts, and have a little kind of pause each time, just so that we can have some kind of conversation amongst yourselves. And then we'll finish with the more kind of open Q&A. And I hope you will question me. I think we learn when we ask questions of each other. And I can sit and chat away and talk about Paul for hours, but I hope that we'll do that in conversation with each other. Let me begin, though, by posing the question, what's happened to Paul on the Damascus Road? That's really going to be our kind of question for tonight. Paul, this figure who has been persecuting the church, chasing after those pesky Christians, those pesky followers of the way, and doing it with some aplomb. He seems to have been quite good at persecuting Christians and chasing after them. But that same Paul has an encounter, an experience. Something happens to him as he ventures one day on the road to Damascus. I'm going to suggest that that's foundational to how we encounter and think of St. Paul. In many ways, everything about Paul needs in some way to go back to Damascus Road. It's seminal, life-changing, church-changing, life-changing event for all concerned. And perhaps as a verse to illustrate that, we'll be referring to the biblical text, and particularly to Paul's writings, a number of times. The text is a little small, so I'll just read it just so we're all clear. It's taken from 2 Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 16, where Paul says, From now on, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we know him no longer in that way. I'm going to suggest that's a window on to what happens on the Damascus Road. I'm also going to suggest there's a bit of a window on to what we're going to be talking about in all of our sessions. That might be kind of the theme verse of these talks. From now on, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we know him that way no longer. We no longer know him in that way. Something changes for Paul. His world gets turned upside down. So we'll keep coming back to 2 Corinthians 5:16 over these next few weeks. When people are trying to assess what happens to St. Paul on the Damascus Road, we often find that 2 words or 2 phrases, 2 ideas are linked or associated in that regard. Firstly, some surmise that Paul is converted on the Damascus Road. And my guess is if I asked many of you what happens to Paul, the word converted might become to your form. Is that a term that we come across? Paul was converted in his theology. However, others might also say that Paul is called. He receives a calling. And then it's just that he receives a calling to be the apostle to the Gentiles. The other apostles will go to the Jews, but that Paul will be the apostle to the Gentiles. And then Paul has this dramatic experience on the Damascus Road, in a way that he becomes a follower of Jesus Christ. He becomes an apostle of Jesus Christ. And we're told in Paul's writings in Galatians in particular that one of the first things he does post-Damascus Road is he goes down to Jerusalem to meet with the other apostles. Have you ever wondered what that meeting might have been like? The person that's been your chasing after you for the past couple of years, the great persecutor of the church, kind of knocks on your door and says, "Hello, I've encountered the risen Jesus Christ. Can I come and join you? I'd like to be a fly on that wall, really." I wonder what they would have talked about. Just in the kind of historical reality of that. What that first meeting with Peter, with James, with John, the early disciples, what would that look like? Paul just kind of turning up and saying, "Well, I was on the road to Damascus." I'm struck by the fact that they speak of Paul's wonderful conversion. Conversion is not a word that Paul speaks of, not in terms of his own encounter on the Damascus Road. It's the word that perhaps the church has applied to it, but it's not the term that Paul himself uses. And we're going to pull that apart very shortly. We'll suggest that actually Paul speaks more of it being a calling than a conversion. But we've called it, when we encounter or when we're kind of looking for descriptions within the biblical text of how of the event that is a Damascus Road experience, Paul actually doesn't talk about it very much. We're going to see a couple of references shortly, but Paul himself doesn't talk very much about it. It's more kind of throwaway lines, really. It's the book of Acts, which I think is probably written by St. Luke. It's Acts that has far more discussion of what the Damascus Road was comprised of. Interesting enough, Luke has 3 quite extended descriptions where Paul recounts what happened to him on the Damascus Road. Acts chapter 9, which is the first instance, Saul's on his way up to Damascus to go and challenge those pesky Christians, and he encounters risen Jesus. Subsequently, later on in Acts, in chapter 22 and chapter 26, Paul's kind of having to kind of plead his case. He's being on trial of sorts. And as part of his kind of defence is where he recounts what happened to him on the Damascus Road. So for Luke, in Acts, Luke has some details in his retelling which I think are quite important. Firstly, Luke suggests that Saul is blinded by the encounter. He's blinded by the encounter, and he's sent to Ananias to replace him, and his sight is restored. But the sight aspect, the blind aspect, it seems to be quite a critical dimension to Luke's retelling of the Damascus Road, that Paul loses his sight. Secondly, Ananias features quite prominently as a figure to whom Saul goes to have his sight restored. And thirdly, in Luke's account, we have Jesus, or Jesus Christ, risen Christ, speaking those famous words, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting me?" So 3 quite critical elements, I think, to Acts telling of this narrative. He was blinded, the Ananias figure is involved, and thirdly, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Houston, we have a problem. Showing my age there, aren't I? Houston. It's not a problem, we have some form of tension. In Paul's retelling of the Damascus Road, albeit in these slightly kind of throwaway comments, there are some really quite important points of difference. Firstly, Paul doesn't say that he was blinded. Actually, as we'll see, what is really, 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 really important for Paul in his retelling of Damascus Road is that he saw Jesus. He saw Jesus. He saw Jesus, the risen Jesus, in the same way that the witnesses of the Easter resurrection saw the risen Jesus. That his resurrection appearance, one to Paul, is as good as, is equal to, is equivalent to that to Peter, to Mary Magdalene, to Thomas and co. Paul saw Jesus. Paul wasn't blinded. He saw the risen Christ. Seeing is really quite important for Paul. Secondly, Paul doesn't mention Ananias. Now, that's an argument from silence. I know he doesn't mention Ananias. If there's no discourse around the blindness, there's no need to mention Ananias. But Ananias is quite a critical figure in the Acts account. He's absent in the Pauline discourse. And thirdly, Paul doesn't report Jesus speaking. If anything, when you trace through how Paul talks about the experience, whereas in Acts it's Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me, i.e. Jesus, Paul speaks of himself as the persecutor of the church, not of Jesus. You might say that it's two sides of the coin, perhaps. But there is still some point of distinction. And again, interestingly, when Paul as a persecutor, and his awareness of the fact that he was a persecutor of the church, is the unifying feature of all the times that Paul talks about his pre-Damascus life. The key thing that he keeps referring back to was, I persecuted the church, I was a persecutor. Now, some have tried to explore the Freudian or a psychological complex that might sit behind that. We won't go there tonight. But Paul speaks of persecuting the church, not really of persecuting Jesus. So, at the beginning of this, I want to kind of draw some attention to just some of the differences we find within the biblical text, in the way that Luke and Acts talk about an account, a really quite an important account, and the way that Paul himself talks about one account. For the rest of our conversation, we're going to be looking primarily about how Paul speaks of such matters. We're doing Paul on Paul rather than Luke on Paul. But we do have different voices, different views, different kind of takes on things. Let's just pause there and just perhaps with those online, just talk with each other, just for...
Was Luke writing before Paul or after Paul?
Good question. Was Luke writing before Paul or after Paul? Most people would say that Paul's writing first and Luke is writing afterwards. Most of us would suggest that actually Paul's letters are the earliest, the first Christian texts. And that 1 Thessalonians, for example, is, we think that's Paul's first letter that he wrote, and therefore that 1 Thessalonians is the earliest Christian text. Written sometime in the early 50s perhaps. And Luke It's a slight, finger up in the air, yes. I'm putting Luke in the late 70s, so about 20 years afterwards. So Paul is the earlier in many ways. Yes, my friend. Oh, the mic is headed your way.
Do we have any idea of the date of the Damascus conversion and Paul's age at the time?
Good question. We would put it probably in the mid-30s, 3 or 4 years after Easter in that regard. It depends where we think Jesus' death is. Is it 30 or is it 33? I'm putting the Damascus Road roughly in the mid-30s. But that's a rough guess rather than an exact one. How old was he? Again, I think he's probably around the 35, 40 mark, but that's more a hunch than a calculation. One of the things you really struggle with is to do a chronology of Paul. We don't have his life story, so trying to map exactly when things happen is always a bit of a hunch, a bit of a best guess. One here, then one.
Okay. It seems apparent that Paul having this experience, this awakening on the road, if he suddenly became able to see on a different plane, he wouldn't consider himself as blinded. So he wouldn't write in that context. But Luke writing afterwards, maybe not having had that sort of spiritual awakening experience himself, might be putting it across in his own words.
I think that's right. I think Luke tells the story in Luke's way. But equally, Paul, as I say, will tell the story in Paul's way. I think there are ways that one can accommodate both views. But I think it's also important to hear how each one respectively makes their account, what they each respectively draw attention to. And they tell it in different ways.
What kind of Jew was Paul? What kind of Jew was he like? What do we know about his Judaism?
We know that it's often said we don't know much about Paul pre-Damascus Road, except that he was a Pharisee and probably on his own opinion was a very good one. I get the impression that Paul was kind of top of the class in kind of Pharisee school, so to speak. His passion, his zeal for persecuting Christians feels really quite robust. It's a broad distinction we find within first century context that there's often said to be kind of two particular schools of Judaism. A Shammite version, which is more hardcore, shall we say, more straight, more conservative in that regard, and a Hillel stream, which is the more, broadly speaking, a more liberal articulation. In Acts, it said that Paul or Saul trained under Rabbi Gamaliel, who was a Hillelite rabbi. So he might have trained in that more liberal tradition, but he seems to represent the more Shammite expression in terms of how he's outworking his understanding of being Jewish. And that's one of the great questions, one of the great things we're going to say over the next few weeks is, what happens to Paul's Jewishness in the life of Damascus Road? Does Paul stop being Jewish? I want to suggest that Paul becomes even more Jewish post-Damascus Road. Or his Jewishness takes on an increased depth and dimension because of the encounter with Jesus Christ. One more at the front, and then one more at the back and one more at the front.
Was Paul Roman? Because he seemed to have that relationship with the Jews in the church. James and Peter called him because he'd been teaching to the Jews, and he had to call on the protection of the centurions, and only Romans could call on the protection of the centurions.
So was Paul a Roman citizen?
Well, was he a Roman citizen? Yeah. And what do we know about that? And he seems to have had a bad relationship with James and Peter. So,
Yeah.
how do you expand on that?
Well, there's several points there. I mean, firstly, it's Luke that tells us that Paul is a Roman citizen. Paul never speaks about his Roman citizenship. He may have been, but Paul doesn't suggest that. I confess I'm surprised he doesn't. When he's writing to the church in Rome, when he's trying to commend himself, I thought he might have kind of dropped that into the conversation, that I'm a Roman citizen, but he doesn't. Paul only speaks of his citizenship as in heaven, in the letter to the Philippians. So Paul might have been, and it really matters for Luke, because when Luke has to get Paul to Rome to have his moment before Caesar, and we see him getting the protection from the centurions accordingly. But Paul's pretty silent on it. And he does have that kind of testy relationship with the other Jerusalem disciples. So when he turns up and knocks on their door, I think there is a bit of a tense relationship, a bit of a friction. I think Paul was quite a strong alpha male. And I suspect that Peter was a fairly strong alpha male too, and rub those two alpha males up together, and that might have been a...
The share of saints there.
Indeed, yes. The church has brought them together in ecumenical spirits in a way that they've a little more targeted to. One here, then we'll go through one more of that.
We had a discussion here on the translation you put on from 2 Corinthians. Yep. Do you think that Paul had ever seen Jesus before he was involved in the Damascus Road?
That's a really good question. The question is, had Paul ever encountered Jesus pre-Damascus Road? In one sense, we don't know. We have no particular evidence either way. I mean, there's a hint at it in 2 Corinthians there, but I think it's at best implicit, at best a hint. Having said that, Paul seems to know Jerusalem quite well. He's been, fairly feisty in his training. I think it seems to be perfectly feasible, perfectly plausible that Paul might have been around Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' arrest, Jesus' crucifixion, and might have picked up something vicariously about the Jesus movement. At the same time, I think it's only a small association. It's interesting that having encountered Jesus Christ on Damascus Road, he has to go to the Jerusalem apostles to say, can you help me fill in the gaps? I've encountered this Jesus figure, can you tell me a bit more about what he was doing, what he was saying? We'll talk a bit more about that in our third session. So I think that they're possibly, but I'm not sure. Final question, then we'll move on to Galatians.
Yeah, I'm just questioning that
Good.
you say Luke says one thing, Paul says something different. Are you saying that Acts isn't an accurate representation of what happened? And in Acts 22 and 26, Paul is the one that's actually speaking and making his defence before courts. So he then talks about meeting Jesus on the Damascus Road, etc.
What do you mean by an accurate representation?
What happened? Luke says this is his script. So
I think Luke has an account to tell. I think Luke wants to make a creditable and faithful narrative of how the gospel spreads from Jerusalem to Rome. But Luke tells the story in a particular way. Luke's sense of history, I think, is a different sense of what history means to us. History in the first century may look a little different to history in the 21st century. We tend to read it as it's about actually what happened in a particular order. I think Luke changes his order slightly. Now, I think that's perfectly legitimate. I think that's perfectly faithful on Luke's part so to do. I think it's about being attentive to how Luke tells the story. Now, that might make some people nervous. I can understand that. But I often say that the New Testament is like an orchestra. Different instruments play different tunes at different times, and we listen to sometimes when the violins are playing, this is them, sometimes the woodwind are playing, sometimes the brass are playing. And it's about being sensitive to hearing the different instruments playing and the melody and the harmony that arises from it. I'm a Salvation by background, brought up in brass bands, so played in Handel's Messiah many times during the Christmas season. And if you're a trumpet player and you're playing Handel's Messiah, you don't do very much. You count a lot, but when you get to the trumpet shall sound, if you don't sound, you've missed your moment. And I think when we're listening to the Messiah, you listen to the different voices. You wait for the trumpet sound. So I'm very happy that Luke tells the story in one way, and Paul might be in a complementary way. There are points of difference, not in a way that can't be ultimately harmonised. Let's turn to how Paul speaks of the Damascus Road encounter. As I said previously, he doesn't talk much about it. It's more kind of passing allusion, passing reference to it, rather than an extended kind of biographical recollection. Our biggest portion is in the beginning of the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 1. And again, I'll just read this just so that we're all kind of clear. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that's proclaimed by me is not of human origin. For I didn't receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through an apocalypse of Jesus Christ. Come to that word shortly. You've heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God, and I was trying to destroy it. I had advanced in Jerusalem beyond many people of my same age. That kind of question you had earlier about how good a Jew was Paul. I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. I was a very good Jew, said Paul. But when God, who'd set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, when God was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I might proclaim among the Gentiles, I didn't confer with any human being. This is from Galatians 1. And much of the first half of Galatians is Paul's defence of his apostleship. His apostleship is up for grabs. It seems that in Galatia there's some outsiders that have come in and said that Paul's okay, but he's not the real McCoy. Listen to us. We're doing the proper Jewish Christian thing. And it seems they're trying to undermine Paul's authority and his apostleship in that regard. And he's very keen to say, I didn't receive the gospel from any human source. I didn't receive it from anyone else. If it's not too irreverent a phrase, I got it from the horse's mouth. I got it from Jesus Christ himself. I encountered the risen Christ. Just as those in Jerusalem encountered the risen Christ. I didn't get it from them. I didn't get it second hand. I didn't get it third hand. I got it from the risen Christ in the same way that they did. He says, I received it through an apocalypse of Jesus Christ. Or through a revelation of Jesus Christ. The book of the Bible, which we know as Revelation, the Greek name for it is apocalypsis. An apocalypse is a revelation, that opening of heaven. God was pleased to reveal his Son to me. We might translate it differently if we wanted to, legitimately, as God was pleased to reveal his Son in me. And maybe it's a bit of both. The revelation of the Son to Paul is also the revelation of God's Son in Paul. A significant moment, the revelation, the apocalypse of Jesus Christ. And Paul recounts how at this time I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. This is in the sense that Paul's unhappy with his life. This is Paul actually very passionate, very zealous. This isn't Paul waiting for God to kind of intervene and sort things out, and wait for Jesus to appear. Now Paul's he's very happy chasing off those pesky Christians. But then God intervenes. God intervenes with that revelation of Jesus Christ. And hence, he speaks of that earlier life, like earlier life in Judaism. That suggests to me that the time before Damascus Road is different to the time post Damascus Road. There is a clear distinction here. Something is different post Damascus Road than is pre-Damascus Road. We don't know much about Paul pre-Damascus Road. We don't have any letters from Paul pre-Damascus Road. And all that we know about Paul pre-Damascus Road is written in letters written post-Damascus Road. So we can only kind of slightly guess at that life. But here Paul speaks of it as my early life in Judaism. I'd advance in Judaism. And some suggest that that's quite a pejorative way of describing Judaism. This is a Jew writing who's saying, perhaps he's being quite critical of a form of Judaism. And some summarize it's Paul being critical of a way that speaks of Judaism as very ethnocentric, very exclusivist. Paul's going to spend the writing letter to the Galatians arguing about those things you do as a Jew, circumcision, Sabbath keeping, eating kosher, the food laws, that those things aren't appropriate for Gentiles who become followers of the way. And maybe Paul's being critical, therefore, of his Jewish background in that regard. So Paul is not unhappy. Paul is very happy on his way to Damascus Road. He's a smiling, happy person having fun. Have you lost me? Oh, I'm back. There we go. Second reference to Damascus Road comes halfway through the first epistle to the Corinthians. It's a short phrase, a short throwaway. It's not ostensibly about Damascus Road, it's more kind of a pathway reference to it. Paul says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen? Again, that's seeing language. Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Again, the visual encounter seems very important for how Paul himself speaks of Damascus Road. And I was interested, he doesn't say, I saw Christ. I saw Jesus. Not Jesus Christ. We're going to say a bit more about that when we talk about Jesus in our third session. It's I saw Jesus, not just Jesus Christ. And secondly, it seems to be linked to his status as an apostle. The Damascus Road seems to me to be intertwined with Paul's understanding of his calling to be an apostle. And if you were to look at the letters that are authored by Paul, where he describes himself in the opening, he says, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the church in Galatia. If he defines himself as an apostle in the opening, it's in those letters where he has to defend himself as an apostle. In letter to the 1 Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians, and in Galatia, and in Romans, where he's trying to commend himself as an apostle. Where his apostleship isn't being contested, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians. Philippians is one big kind of loving, they were going to love each other in Philippi. He doesn't self-identify as an apostle. He self-identifies as an apostle when it's being challenged. And when his apostleship is challenged, he kind of goes back to Damascus Road. I didn't get it from Jerusalem. I didn't get it from human source. I got my apostleship from the risen Jesus Christ. My apostleship is as good as, is equivalent to, is the same as their apostleship. One sense it's Paul's got a bit of a chip on his shoulder at times, about having to defend himself about the fact that his apostleship is as good as that of those in Jerusalem. And then a third reference to the Damascus Road, from the text which we, in many of our churches, will hear on Easter Sunday morning, if we have a New Testament text read to us. For I hand on to you as of first importance that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas, to Peter, and then to the 12. Then to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time. Quite a big gathering. Most of them were still alive. Then he appeared to James. We assume that's his half-brother, James. And then to all the apostles. Last of all, but in continuity with all of these other resurrection appearances, he appeared to me as one untimely born. Strange phrase, isn't it? One untimely born. It could be that untimely born is just a chronological language. I wasn't in Jerusalem on Easter Sunday to have my resurrection. I was in the right place at the right time. Going back to our kind of question earlier on about whether Paul had encountered Jesus pre-Damascus Road. And it's possible that it could just be a chronological designation. It's possible, though, that the Greek is a little bit ambiguous here. It could be a reference to, in the Greek, to Paul having some kind of disability. And actually, there was this remarkable appearance of Jesus to Paul as one who was in some way disabled. Elsewhere in his letters, Paul speaks as having a thorn in his flesh. And there's been a cottage industry of interpretation about what that thorn in the flesh might have been. Was it some form of disability? Was it some form of pain? Was it some form of situation? I'm minded that Paul had a speech disability. In letter to the Corinthians, it said that he's very good in writing, but he ain't much cop in terms of his preaching, in his spoken word. If he was any decent apostle, he'd be really good in speech. So it's only my kind of hunch, it's only my kind of instinct, but I think he might have had some speech disability which limited his rhetorical capacity. And it may be that 1 Corinthians 15 alludes to Paul having some form of disability, yet still being invited into the apostolic realm. So only a few kind of passing references. Galatians 1, 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians 15 to the Damascus Road. But the continuity with them, I think, is that Paul sees Jesus, that it's linked to his apostolic status, and it was equivalent to, it was the same as the other resurrection appearances to the other apostles. And Paul has been quite defensive, but in the context of letters that he's writing, I think he's having to be quite defensive. Let's take another 7th inning stretch. Have a conversation with us, one or two people around you, and then... Oh, the spirit is moving.
Hiya. Surely Paul classified as having a disability. Would that not have disbarred him from being a Pharisee?
Yes. Possibly. Initial stages, but the regulations about what enabled you to be a Pharisee A, are contested, and B, maybe a little bit later in rabbinic teaching than in the 1st century. The rabbinic texts that we kind of find out what kind of constitutes a Pharisee are kind of 2 or 3 centuries later in origin. They may reflect early tradition, but it's hard to be confident about what might have entailed. It's often said that was Paul married or not? It suggested that in order to be a Pharisee, you would need to be married. And we don't get much evidence in the letters of Paul being married, for example. So again, it may be kind of later tradition being imported back into the 1st century. So it's possible, I don't know. But a good question.
You said something that fascinated me that I've never heard before, and I want to know how we know it. You said that Gamaliel was Beth Hillel and not Beth Shammai. Where did you know that from?
Again, I think it's in rabbinic tradition. I think that Gamaliel is a well-known rabbi in the writing. So I'm not exactly sure I know that, but I do know it. But I will go home and check how I know it. So thank you. And I'll figure that out next week. Okay, well, let's... one more at the front.
I might be being a bit simplistic.
Join the club.
On Tony Lord, just brings up version 8 to Paul after everybody else who wasn't there at the start, you can believe at the start.
And it just may be a temporal or chronological method. It just happened a bit later. You know, 3 or 4 years, 3 or 4 years afterwards. And I suspect the majority view is with you. But there is equally a minority view wants to kind of flag the disability question. And one can make a linguistic kind of case for it. But equally, I think that there may be that those who want to make a case for it want to make a case because they want to make a case for it. That it's kind of the answer they want, and that's why they end up with the answer that they would like. Not that we'd ever do that, of course, ourselves. The scriptures fit what we wanted to find. Okay, but let's try and bring matters together just by drawing out some wider principles of this discourse. What then is the significance of the Damascus Road for St. Paul? What are our headlines? If we were poked in the middle of the night at 2 a.m, and we said, for you, Dave, what's the significance of the Damascus Road for Paul? What might we say? Some might say, well, the significance of the Damascus Road for Paul was that his name changed. His name changed from being Saul to Paul. Equally, I think if I were to ask people in my church, in my congregation over in Sutton, when does Paul's name change, I'd bet £5 at least that they would say his name changed after Damascus Road. What's the mood in the room? Would you?
No, he was still being called Saul after that in Acts.
No, yeah, exactly. I think it's one of those kind of misunderstandings that's kind of quite common around churches, that people think that it changes his name after Damascus Road. No, it's actually a bit later on in Acts. It's in Acts 13 when Paul's on his first missionary journey. He arrives in Cyprus with Saul and Barnabas. And when they go to Cyprus, they encounter this figure. He's the proconsul called Sergius Paulus, who seems quite a good guy. Seems to be quite interested in this Jesus Christ thing. And in the subsequent discourse, again in Acts 13, here we have Luke referring to, but Saul, also known as Paul. This is the time when, for Acts at least, Saul becomes Paul. In Paul, Paul's always Paul. Paul's never Saul. But in Luke, in Acts, there is this change. And it happens in the light of the encounter with Sergius Paulus. And it's a bit of a guess, but I think it's a reasonable guess, that maybe this Sergius Paulus becomes Paul's patron. The one who kind of makes things happen for Paul, who opens doors, who kind of gives him permission to engage in evangelism and ministry. And it's quite common for you to take on the name of your patron. And I think that's quite possible that in one context known as Saul, now with his patron Sergius Paulus looking out for him, he self-identifies as Paul. Not a knockdown argument, but I think it's feasible. But it doesn't happen on the Damascus Road. So I don't think it's a change in name. What else might it be? Is it a conversion to Christianity? And again, I think many might initially suggest that it is. Is that what Paul says about the event? No. Again, going back to that Galatians 1 passage. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace. Not God put me through some kind of conversion experience. Paul speaks of Damascus Road as a calling to be an apostle to the Gentiles. The Jerusalem apostles, they'll go to Jews. They'll be apostle to the Jews. Peter can be the apostle to the Jews. But Paul receives the calling to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And thus was Paul converted to Christianity? It's not language that he uses. I want to say, not if it means Paul stops being Jewish. Paul is even more Jewish post-Damascus Road. He self-identifies as Jewish. He carries on self-identifying as Jewish. He has a particular interest and passion for his Jewish sisters and brothers. So I hesitate about the word conversion. Clearly something significant happens. Clearly his world gets turned on its head. But is it a conversion? Not if it means Paul not remaining Jew. We'll explore more of that over the next couple of weeks. We're flashing now. I was quite excited about finding the flash the moment I'm having. Is it perhaps, and I think this is the best, this is where I want to kind of tick it. It is some kind of change in identity. Something about him is turned on its head. And here I want to take us just back to Philippians. And to look from the book, the letter of Philippians chapter 3. Where Paul says, if anyone else had reason to be confident in the flesh, I've more. I've got all of these badges of honour. I've got all of these certificates after I'm married. What does he say? I was circumcised on the 8th day. My parents made sure I was circumcised properly Jewish. I had good Jewish parents. I tick that Jewish box. I'm a member of the people of Israel. I'm an Israelite through and through. I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. Why is that important? I think it's important for two reasons. Firstly, that being able to trace your lineage is significant within a first century Jewish mindset. Knowing where you come from, being able to trace it is significant. And he also traces it to the line of Benjamin. A question for any kind of Bible experts in the room. Who in the Old Testament is the most famous Benjamite? Not Benjamin himself.
King Saul.
Very good, the front row. King Saul was a Benjamite. King Saul, the first king of Israel. And it's possible, and it's only possible, so don't quote me, it may be that Saul was a Benjamite name. And therefore this may implicitly be a way that Paul himself recognises that I'm also known as Saul because of that kind of Benjamite connection. It's hardly a knockdown argument, but it's a possible one. A Hebrew born of Hebrews. You know, if there's a Blackpool rock, you've got Blackpool written down, and you break it, you've got Blackpool down the middle. It's almost like when you break me in half, says Paul, I've got Hebrew right down my middle. I'm classic, I'm a good Jew. As to the law, a Pharisee, I know the law, I observe the law, I keep the law. When it comes to zeal, I'm top of the class, persecuting the church. As to righteousness under the law, I'm blameless. I know how the sacrificial system looks after me. I'm top of my class. I've got all of those certificates, all of those badges. In Judaism 101, I'm top of the class. But whatever gains I had, whatever those certificates, whatever those letters after my name, I count them as loss. Paul's world gets turned upside down because of the encounter on Damascus Road. Everything which was his badges of honour, everything that was a plus, now counts for nothing. He actually says, final sentence, for his sake I have suffered loss of all things, and And I consider them as, or the NRSV is translated as rubbish. That's a polite term. It's poo. It's probably even a bit more ruder than poo, actually. That's everything which has been in his forte, his strength, is now poo. Something dramatic has changed because of that encounter with Christ. And he's now the apostle to the Gentiles. I may see some echoes here, perhaps, of the call of Jeremiah, when he writes Galatians 1:15. Maybe echoes of Jeremiah 1:5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you to be either a prophet or an apostle to the nations or the Gentiles. So to go back to the collect, I don't think it is a conversion. I think it's a call. It's a rather wonderful conversion. It's not come out very well in this PowerPoint. I would say it's a wonderful calling. And that's in sum. What's the significance of Paul? 3 things. Jesus is alive, not dead. Praise God. And that Jesus Christ is God's Messiah. And therefore the resurrection of the dead has happened. And most importantly, Paul has to deal with the implications of a crucified Messiah. That's been the problem. That's why he's been chasing those pesky Christians, because they're worshipping a crucified Messiah. With the revelation of Damascus Road. But actually that's how God has dealt with the world, through a crucified Messiah. The problem is actually God's solution. So much of Paul's theology now is working back from that. If the crucified Jesus is God's solution, what's the problem? And I'll say more about that in the next couple of weeks. Let's take a few moments just for a few more questions before we bring things close. Any other matters from the floor? I'm with my friend here.
I think that reference that when God would set me apart, I think that may well refer to his disability. And I think that it could be by his grace or through his grace. That occurs sometime later. And it could be. I think it's confusing to put it in the same sentence. It's almost 2 sentences to me.
Quite possibly, it may have reference to disability. Sometimes when we're trying to translate Paul or make him write in nice sentences, it's not easy. As you know, Paul probably dictated his letters, and he's got a scribe writing down. And I get the impression Paul wasn't always the best dictator. And Turkish writers, don't change that, scribe that away. So the opening of Ephesians, chapter 1, is just one very, 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 very long sentence, which our English translators have to kind of break up and put full stops and capital letters in. So we always start hesitant about trying to read behind those things, because Paul sometimes just isn't a very good what's the word? Dictator. Dictating speech, not dictating in terms of power.
disciples and that were all wonderful and friends of Jesus, that some of the things he comes out with are actually his way of saying, look, God chose me. Whereas with the other disciples, they did all of this, that and the other, and they spoke in tongues and everything. He was at a disadvantage, so he needed to spend his time building up his own self-esteem.
I think it's a good comment. I think there is a... That's kind of, I believe that's earlier on, this kind of Paul's strong figure. And what do the other apostles make of this Johnny come lately? That says he's the one that's called to the Gentiles and they can go just to the Jews. Is there some initial suspicion? And we see evidence of that in the Pauline letters. We'll say a bit more of this in a couple of weeks' time. In Galatians 2, Paul and Peter just have a face-off in Antioch. There is some quite strong tension between the two. In the book of Acts, we might suggest that they're all one big happy family. And that, I'm sure that's the case in many ways. But in Paul, we also see those points of disagreement. In that sense that Paul maybe has some sense of inferiority, that he hadn't been with Jesus. He hadn't walked for 3 years with Jesus. And maybe the Jerusalem apostles said, yeah, well, we did that. We walked the walk. We were there through the good times and the bad times. You just turn up and say that you've had a similar call. So I think there's just in the human sense there may be some points of tension within the early church, just trying to make sense of that. Alison's doing well, she's in her laps.
What level of persecution do you think Paul, obviously before he saw the lies with Christians, what kind of level are we talking?
We don't really know. So we don't know about the precise nature of that. A, it's very early. B, we don't have much evidence from Paul himself about Paul pre-Damascus Road. One sense is that it was fairly harsh. That it was difficult to be a follower of the way, and there were people who wanted to put you to some form of persecution. But the precise contours of that we just don't really have access to, unfortunately. In Acts, of course, Saul, as he was there, Saul Stratford, is said to be present at Stephen's martyrdom. Whether he was or not, I don't know, I wasn't there. But that suggests there were some points of tension fairly early on, particularly in Jerusalem, I think it's particularly around the worship of Jesus. For me, I think we take more account of the worship, the fact that very early on the church are worshipping Jesus as God. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. Not the name of God, every knee shall bow. At the name of Jesus. If you're a good monotheistic Jew, here are people who are worshipping Jesus in the same way that God is worshipped. How do we get around that? Final question from my friends here, then we'll bring matters to a close.
In Acts, we hear that Paul had letters of authority to do things to the Christians at Damascus, but Damascus surely wasn't within the power of the Jerusalem authorities. What could he have done?
You're on form tonight, aren't you?
I don't know. It seems to be that he can do something that would have caused some distress, and he seems to be going there quite purposefully. That he so can do. post-Damascus Road, very quickly, Paul starts causing problems on the other side. Paul himself has to make a swift exit out of Damascus, a swift exit out of the window, because he seems he's proclaiming the gospel is causing problems from the other side. Whatever he does, it rubs some people up the wrong way. So I don't precisely know, but he seems to be charged with doing something significant. Okay, well, thank you, friends. We will pick up matters in a few minutes.
Can we just give them a massive round of applause? I really enjoyed that. Thank you. It was a fantastic talk, as always. So thanks today.